My parents raised my rent to support my golden brother and his family, so I packed my things and moved out. Hey everyone, before I start, I need to ask you a favor. Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. Seriously, it helps a lot. The channel isn't getting as many views as it used to, and barely anyone watches till the end. Let's change that. Hi Reddit. I'm 26, and I still live with my parents, not because I have to, but because it's convenient. I have a solid job as a developer, my office is nearby, and most importantly, I'm saving money for my own startup in the gaming industry. But here's the thing, I don't live here for free. For the past 8 years, I've been paying my parents $500 a month in rent. When I turned 18, they told me I was an adult now and had to contribute financially. Fair enough. The deal seemed reasonable. I got my own room, access to home-cooked meals, and no major expenses weighing me down. It wasn't a bad setup, at least, that's what I thought, until I started to realize that I was the only one actually paying for anything in this house. See, I have an older brother, Artem. He's 29, and he's always been the golden child. He's never had a stable job because he's been finding himself for the past decade. First, he wanted to be an actor, but that flopped. Then, he tried to start a business, burned through all of our parents' money, and it failed. After that, he jumped into crypto investments, and let's just say it didn't go well. Every single time he failed, my parents made excuses for him. They always said he was just trying to figure out his path, or that he was talented and just needed time, or that he needed support. Guess who was actually providing that support? It was me. I honestly didn't care until it started affecting me directly. One day, I came home from work, opened the fridge, and noticed it was practically empty. No big deal, I thought. I'd just go to the store. But when I went to ask my parents what they needed, I was met with the kind of expressions that immediately told me something was wrong. My mom said my name in that slow, careful tone she used when she was about to bring up something she knew I wouldn't like. My dad nodded and went straight to the point, saying that they had been thinking and decided my rent wasn't exactly fair anymore. For a second, I thought they were finally acknowledging how unfair it was that I was paying while Artem got a free ride. But no, my dad continued, saying that I made more money than I did 8 years ago, and that it was only fair that I contribute a little more. I felt my stomach tighten and asked how much more they were talking about. My mom hesitated, as if she didn't want to say it out loud, and then finally spoke, saying they thought $500 was too low and that $1,000 would be more reasonable. I actually laughed and asked if they were serious. Artem was sitting at the table playing on his phone, not even bothering to look up. My mom continued, saying that I always talked about wanting my own business and that meant I was making good money, and on top of that, their expenses had gone up. I turned to Artem and asked how much he was paying. My mom immediately stiffened and said that my brother was in a difficult place right now. I cut her off and asked what kind of difficult place he was in this time, whether it was another crisis of finding himself. My dad shifted uncomfortably and said that this wasn't up for discussion. That's when I realized they never intended to have an actual conversation. They had already decided I would pay more, and they were just informing me. I simply said no. My mom asked what I meant, and I repeated that I wasn't paying more. My dad let out a long sigh like I was a stubborn child, and then said that maybe it was time I found my own place. That's when it got really interesting. I asked if that meant that if I didn't agree to pay more, they were kicking me out. My mom immediately started backtracking, saying of course not, but that they thought maybe this was a sign that it was time for me to move on. I slowly nodded and said all right. Their faces shifted, and they clearly weren't expecting me to agree so easily. I told them I would move out, but not in the way they thought. I stood up, pulled out my phone, and started scrolling through rental listings while my parents sat in silence, and Artem continued staring at his phone, completely uninterested. They thought they could just push me into paying more. They thought I would beg them to let me stay. But they had no idea I had been planning for this moment for a long time. And if they wanted to play games, I could play too. I was already looking at apartments, weighing my options, and thinking about how I wanted to handle my move when everything took a turn for the worse. I came home from work one evening, exhausted and ready to just grab something to eat and relax, only to open the door and be greeted by chaos. The first thing I noticed was the noise, kids screaming, running, something crashing in the kitchen, and then, as if on cue, a dog barking loudly. I froze for a second, completely thrown off, before stepping inside and finding my parents' house turned into a madhouse. Before I could process what was happening, my mom appeared from the kitchen, looking a little too cheerful for the situation. She walked up to me, acting as if nothing was out of the ordinary, and said, "Oh good, you're home." I was still standing there in confusion when suddenly 2 small figures came barreling past me, nearly knocking over a lamp in the hallway. I looked at her and asked, "What is going on?" Before she could answer, my dad stepped into the room, and behind him, standing like they belonged there, were Artem and Lisa, along with their kids, Sophia and Timothy. Artem smirked and lifted his arms like he was making some grand entrance, saying, "Surprise, we're staying for a while." Lisa, standing next to him, gave a half-hearted smile before turning her attention back to her phone, as if this entire situation wasn't a big deal. I blinked, looked back at my parents, and waited for someone to explain, but no one seemed in any hurry to do so. Finally, my dad cleared his throat and said, "Your brother and his family needed a place to stay for a bit, so they are moving in." I stood there, processing the words, before looking back at Artem and Lisa, who were already making themselves comfortable. I asked, "When exactly was anyone going to tell me about this?" My mom gave me a look like I was being unreasonable and said, "We didn't think we needed your permission. Dear, it's our house, and your brother is family." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "So you just let them move in without a single word to me? You didn't think it might be worth mentioning that 4 more people and a dog would suddenly be living here?" Lisa sighed dramatically, finally looking up from her phone, and said, "Oh, come on. It's not like we had a choice. We got evicted." Artem shrugged like it was nothing and added, "Yeah, the landlord was being a total jerk about the rent." I raised an eyebrow at that and asked, "Or you just didn't pay it?" Artem made a face like I had just insulted him, but he didn't answer. My dad stepped in again and said, "It doesn't matter what happened. They are here now, and we all need to be supportive." I wanted to argue, wanted to point out how ridiculous it was that they didn't even ask my opinion when I was literally paying to live here, while Artem and his family were getting a free ride yet again, but I could already tell it wouldn't matter. My parents had made up their minds, and now I was just expected to deal with it. The first few days were unbearable. The kids had no concept of personal space, running up and down the house at all hours, screaming, fighting, and knocking things over. It wasn't even like they were just being kids. It was like they had no rules. At one point, I walked into the living room and found Sophia standing on the couch, jumping up and down while Timothy was using my laptop charger as a jump rope. I told them to stop, but they just laughed and ran off. The worst part was the dog. It was some medium-sized mutt that barked at anything that moved, but that wasn't the real issue. The real issue was that it had decided my belongings were its personal chew toys. The first victim was one of my shoes, which I found in the backyard, torn apart like it had been through a shredder. When I confronted Lisa about it, she barely looked up from her phone and said, "Oh, that's just what he does. Just keep your stuff out of reach." I asked if she was planning on paying for the damages, but she just rolled her eyes and said, "Relax, it's just a shoe." Things only got worse from there. Artem and Lisa didn't contribute to groceries, didn't offer to pitch in for utilities, and seemed to believe they were staying in a free hotel with full service. Every time I opened the fridge, more food was gone, yet they never went shopping to replace anything. My parents, of course, acted like this was completely fine. If I brought it up, they would just say, "They are in a difficult situation, be patient." The final straw came when I woke up early one morning to find Lisa making herself a coffee while wearing one of my hoodies. I stared at her for a moment before asking, "Is that mine?" She casually looked down, as if she had just noticed, and said, "Oh yeah, I was cold last night, and it was just hanging on the chair." I waited for her to take it off, or at least acknowledge that she had taken something without asking. But instead, she just yawned and kept sipping her coffee. I had reached my limit. I had been patient, I had kept my mouth shut, but it was clear that they had no intention of respecting boundaries, contributing, or even acknowledging how much they were taking advantage of everyone, especially me. It was time for me to put my own plans into motion, and if they thought they could keep treating me like an afterthought, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. A few weeks into this nightmare, I was already at my limit. Every morning, I woke up to screaming children running up and down the hallway, the sound of their dog barking at absolutely nothing, and the realization that whatever food I had planned on eating for breakfast had mysteriously vanished from the fridge overnight. It wasn't just annoying anymore, it was exhausting. I barely had a moment to myself, and the house I had been living in for years now felt like a chaotic daycare that I was being forced to endure. One evening, after a particularly long and stressful day at work, I came home and immediately noticed my mom waiting for me in the kitchen. She had that look on her face, the one she always had when she was about to ask me for something but wanted to make it seem like it was just a small favor. I sighed before even sitting down, already bracing myself for whatever nonsense was coming next. She started off with, "Maxim, we need to talk," and before I could even respond, she jumped right into it, saying, "The family is going through a difficult time right now, and we were hoping you could help out a little more." I sat down, rubbing my temples, already knowing where this was going. I asked her how exactly they expected me to help, and she gave me the most innocent smile as she said, "Well, we were thinking maybe you could contribute just a little more each month, just until things settle down." I asked how much, and without hesitation, she said, "For $100 extra should do it." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I genuinely couldn't believe what I was hearing. I looked her straight in the eye and asked, "Does Artem pay anything?" My mom immediately shifted uncomfortably, her smile faltering just a bit, and said, "Well, you know they are going through a difficult period right now." I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly before responding. "So let me get this straight. I already pay rent in a house I don't even get to enjoy anymore. I buy my own food, which your son and his family eat without asking. I deal with constant noise, mess, and their dog destroying my stuff. And now, instead of asking them to contribute, you're asking me for more money?" She sighed dramatically, as if I was the one being unreasonable, and said, "Maxim, you know your brother's situation is different." I asked how exactly it was different, considering we were both adults living in the same house. Yet somehow, I was expected to pull my weight while he got to do nothing. She gave me the usual excuses about how he had a family to take care of and how this was just a rough patch for them. But I had heard it all before. I shook my head and said, "No, I am not paying more, and you know what? I am done even paying what I already do." She gasped like I had just said something outrageous. But before she could argue, I stood up and told her, "I am looking for a place, and as soon as I find one, I am out." She immediately tried to backpedal, saying there was no need to be so dramatic, but I was already walking away, unwilling to entertain the conversation any further. I thought that was the end of it for the night, but I should have known better. The next morning, I was barely awake, still groggy from a late night of searching for apartments, when I heard loud knocking on my door. Before I could even get up, my mom barged in, followed closely by Lisa, who looked as if she had been dragged out of bed for this conversation. My mom smiled at me like she was about to give me some wonderful news and said, "We have something important to discuss." I didn't say anything, just stared at her, waiting for whatever nonsense she had planned. She cleared her throat and continued, "Since you are home most of the time after work, we figured you could help out by watching the kids in the evenings." I blinked, thinking I must have misheard, but then Lisa chimed in, saying, "Yeah, it would really help. I mean, we need a break sometimes, and since you're already here, it just makes sense." I sat up and laughed, this time out of sheer disbelief, and asked, "So let me get this straight. First, you want me to pay more rent while Artem pays nothing, and now, you also expect me to be a free babysitter?" My mom immediately tried to soften it by saying, "It's not babysitting, it's just helping family, and besides, you are great with kids." Lisa nodded like this was all completely reasonable and added, "It's not like they are that hard to handle." I didn't even try to hide my irritation anymore. I looked at my mom and asked, "Do I look like a free nanny to you? Because that's what this sounds like." She gave me that disappointed mother look and said, "Maxim, don't be selfish, they need support right now." I clenched my jaw and responded, "Then maybe Artem should start acting like an adult and support his own family instead of dumping his responsibilities on everyone else." Lisa immediately got defensive and said, "He is doing his best." I scoffed and asked, "Really?" Because from where I'm sitting, his best looks an awful lot like doing nothing. My mom put her hands on her hips and said, "I don't understand why you are being so difficult about this. You live here, and we all need to do our part." I stood up and looked her dead in the eye, saying, "Then why doesn't Artem do his part? Why is it always on me?" She opened her mouth to answer but then closed it, realizing she had nothing to say that wouldn't make her sound like a hypocrite. I exhaled sharply and said, "I am done. I am not paying more, I am not watching their kids, and I am leaving this house as soon as I can." Lisa scoffed and said, "Oh please, you've been saying that, but you're still here." I turned to her and said, "Give me 1 week, and I will be gone." With that, I grabbed my keys and walked out of the house before I could be dragged into any more insanity. If they thought they could guilt me into staying or paying for everyone else's mess, they were about to get a serious wake-up call. This was the final straw, and I was done playing their games. I had spent the entire day at work distracted, my mind racing with everything that had been happening at home. No matter how much I tried to focus on coding, my thoughts kept circling back to the absurdity of the situation. I had always known my parents favored Artem, but this was beyond anything I had imagined. They were not just enabling him. They were actively expecting me to carry the weight of his failures. The frustration had been building up for days, and by the time I got home, I knew I had to say something. That evening, after dinner, I found my parents sitting in the living room. My mom was watching one of her reality shows, while my dad was half reading the newspaper, pretending to be interested. I stood in front of them, taking a deep breath before speaking, because I already knew how this conversation was going to go. I told them we needed to talk, and before they could brush me off, I asked them point blank if they thought the way things were going was fair. My mom barely looked up from the screen and asked what I meant. I exhaled, trying to keep my temper in check, and explained that I had been paying rent for years while Artem had never contributed a dime. I told them that I had worked hard to be independent, Yet I was the one being asked to sacrifice more while my brother got to lounge around and do nothing. My dad sighed as if he had heard this all before and gave me a tired look. My mom finally turned toward me, tilting her head in that patronizing way she did when she thought I was overreacting. She said, "Maxim, Artem has children. He can't just go out and earn money like you do." I blinked at her, stunned by how casually she dismissed everything I had said, as if having kids somehow excused not paying rent, not buying groceries, and not even attempting to find a solution. I reminded her that Lisa also didn't work, that they both had the ability to do something, anything, to contribute, yet instead, they were just coasting while everyone else picked up the slack. Before she could answer, my dad chimed in, lowering his newspaper and looking at me with that usual serious expression. He said, "Maxim, you're young, you'll have time to live for yourself, but right now, family needs to come first." My fingers curled into fists at my sides as I struggled to keep calm. I asked him why that only applied to me. If family was supposed to come first, why didn't Artem have to do anything? Why was I the only one being told to sacrifice? My dad shrugged and said, "Artem's situation is different, and you know that." I laughed under my breath, shaking my head in disbelief. It was always different when it came to Artem. It had been different when he failed out of college, and they covered for him. It had been different when he lost all their money trying to start a business. It had been different when he spent years chasing some pipe dream instead of getting a stable job. And now, it was different because he had kids. There was always some excuse for why he didn't have to be held accountable, while I was expected to step up and handle everything like it was my duty. At that moment, Artem strolled into the room, stretching and yawning like he had just woken up from the most peaceful nap of his life. He glanced at me, then at our parents, and smirked before asking, "What's all the drama about this time?" My mom immediately softened, as if just seeing him had put her in a better mood. Before I could even answer, she sighed and said, "Your brother is upset about the rent situation." Artem raised an eyebrow, then let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Forget it, dude, money is not the main thing." I turned to him, my patience officially gone. I asked him if money was not the main thing. Then why was he enjoying all of mine? Why was he living in a house he didn't pay for, eating food he didn't buy, and expecting me to step in and be his free babysitter? He rolled his eyes and shrugged, saying I was making a big deal out of nothing. He told me that life was about more than just working and paying bills, and that I should learn to relax. I stared at him, genuinely at a loss for words. It was easy for him to say that when he was benefiting from my hard work. He had no responsibilities because everyone around him had been conditioned to pick up after him. I turned back to my parents, asking if they really didn't see how insane this was. My mom sighed again, already tired of the conversation, and said, "Maxim, we are all doing what we can." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. That was the problem. I was doing everything I could, and they were doing nothing. It was as if no matter what I said, no matter how obvious the imbalance was, they would never admit it. They would never ask Artem to step up because they had spent his entire life making sure he never had to. I realized then that I wasn't going to get through to them. They had already made up their minds about how this family worked, and no amount of logic or reasoning was going to change that. I took a step back, looking at each of them, and finally said, "I am done." They all looked at me, confused, and I repeated it, making sure they understood. "I am done trying to reason with you. I am done pretending that this is okay." Artem just scoffed, clearly unbothered, but my parents looked at each other with uncertainty. My dad sighed again and said, "You're making too big a deal out of this." I shook my head, told them they could believe whatever they wanted, and walked away. As I headed to my room, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about frustration anymore. This was the moment I knew that staying in this house wasn't an option anymore. They were never going to change, and I had wasted too much time trying to convince them. It was time to stop fighting and start planning my way out. The moment I walked away from that conversation, I knew there was no point in arguing anymore. I had wasted enough breath trying to explain the obvious, and it was clear that nothing was ever going to change. My parents would always see Artem as the one who needed support, and I would always be the one expected to provide it. There was no reasoning with them, no way to make them see how unfair it was, so I stopped trying. Instead, I made a decision. I was leaving, and I wasn't going to give them a chance to talk me out of it. I had already been casually browsing apartment listings, but now I shifted my focus entirely to finding something realistic as soon as possible. I wasn't about to give my parents or Artem the satisfaction of knowing they had pushed me out, so I made sure to keep everything quiet. I didn't tell them I was looking, didn't leave any hints, and didn't change my routine in any noticeable way. If they realized what I was doing, I knew exactly how it would go. My mom would start guilt-tripping me, talking about how families should stick together. My dad would say I was being too emotional and that I should just let things go. Artem would make some smug comment about how I was overreacting and should just deal with it. I wasn't about to sit through any of that. I would leave on my terms, without their input, without their manipulation, and without any chance for them to convince me to stay. For the next week, I did everything quietly. I started packing my things, but not in a way that would draw attention. I took a few books off my shelves and stored them in my car. A couple of shirts here and there disappeared from my closet and into a duffel bag I kept in my trunk. I gradually moved small but important things out, a hard drive, some paperwork, anything that I would need immediately once I left. I didn't take anything big at once because I knew my mom would notice, and the last thing I wanted was for her to start asking questions. While I was doing that, I kept searching for a place. I had already accepted that renting a full apartment on my own would be too expensive, especially since I wanted to keep saving for my startup. I was willing to sacrifice a bit of personal space if it meant getting out of that house and having some peace. That's when I remembered an old friend, Daniel, who had mentioned a while back that he was looking for a roommate. I hadn't thought much about it at the time, but now it seemed like the perfect solution. I texted him and asked if the offer was still open. He replied almost immediately, saying he had been about to put out another listing since no one had taken the room yet. The rent was $600, all utilities included, which was still cheaper than what my parents were trying to charge me to stay in that madhouse. The location was decent, not too far from my office, and the best part was that I actually liked Daniel. He was responsible, had a steady job, and most importantly, he wasn't an entitled leech like my brother. We talked for a bit, and I told him I could move in by the end of the week. He was thrilled, saying he had been hoping to get the room filled soon, and I told him I would send over the deposit that night. As soon as I hung up, I felt a weight lift off my chest. It was happening. I had my escape plan, and all that was left was to execute it without setting off any alarms. For the next few days, I kept playing along like everything was normal. I listened to my mom talk about how hard things were for Artem and Lisa, as if they were helpless victims instead of two adults who refused to take responsibility for their own lives. I watched as my dad gave me the same tired speech about how I should be more understanding. I ignored Artem's lazy comments about how life wasn't all about money while he continued to mooch off everyone around him. None of it mattered anymore. In my mind, I was already gone. I kept sneaking more of my things out, making sure to take only what I absolutely needed first. I knew that once I left, I would still have to come back at least once to grab the bigger items, but I wanted to minimize that as much as possible. The goal was to make my exit as clean as I could. If they didn't realize I was gone until I was already settled in my new place, that would be ideal. By the time Friday rolled around, I had everything lined up. The keys to my new place were waiting for me. My essentials were already packed and hidden in my car, and I had a solid excuse to be out of the house for most of the day. I told my mom I had a work project that would keep me late, which wasn't unusual, so she didn't suspect anything. I had planned every detail carefully, and as I left the house that morning, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: relief. I was finally taking control of my own life, and they had no idea what was coming. The night before, I barely slept. Not because I was nervous, but because I was too eager for morning to come. I had spent years being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who always picked up the slack without question. But now, for the first time, I was choosing myself. I had planned every detail, packed everything I needed, and made sure there was no way they could stop me. By the time my alarm buzzed at 5 in the morning, I was already half awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the moment to get moving. I took a deep breath, then quietly got up and grabbed the last of my things. Most of my essentials were already in my car, but there were still a few final items I needed to take: my laptop, the last of my clothes, and a few things I had deliberately left behind to avoid suspicion. I moved quickly, stuffing everything into my duffel bag as quietly as possible. The house was completely silent except for the faint ticking of the kitchen clock down the hall. My parents were still asleep, and so was Artem, probably sprawled out in bed like he didn't have a care in the world. Lisa would still be knocked out too, and the kids, thankfully, wouldn't be up for at least another 2 hours. This was my window, my one chance to get out without a scene. I slipped into the hallway, walking as lightly as I could while balancing the weight of my bags. The front door was only a few steps away. I was almost there. But then, just as my fingers touched the doorknob, I heard it, a low growl from the other side of the house. My heart stopped. That stupid dog. I turned my head slowly and saw him standing there in the dim light of the living room. Eyes locked on me, tail stiff, ears perked up. He hadn't started barking yet, but I could see it coming. My breath caught in my throat as I held up my hand, whispering a quiet, "No, stay quiet." He didn't listen. The barking started as a sharp, piercing noise that shattered the silence, echoing through the entire house like a fire alarm. I clenched my jaw, already hearing the sound of movement from down the hall. Someone was waking up. I had to move. I threw open the door, stepping out onto the porch as fast as I could without making more noise. The cold morning air hit me, but I didn't stop. The barking grew louder behind me, and I knew I had seconds before someone came stumbling out to see what was going on. I rushed to my car, yanked the door open, and tossed my bag onto the passenger seat. Just as I slammed the door shut, I saw the light flick on in the hallway window. Someone was up. I turned the key in the ignition, and the car rumbled to life. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my pulse hammering in my ears, but I didn't hesitate. I pulled out of the driveway, glancing in the rearview mirror just in time to see the front door open. My dad stepped out onto the porch, still half asleep, looking around in confusion. He didn't see me at first, but by the time he realized my car was backing away, it was too late. I didn't stop. As I reached the end of the street, I pulled out my phone and sent the only message I was going to leave behind. I'm gone. Don't try to contact me. That was it. No explanations. No arguments. No justifications. I didn't know them any. I turned onto the main road, watching as the neighborhood faded away behind me. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking back. I wasn't staying to clean up someone else's mess. I wasn't putting myself last. I was free. I had barely settled into my new place before the call started. My phone, which had been blissfully quiet for the first few hours of freedom, suddenly wouldn't stop buzzing. I ignored the first call, then the second, and then the third. By the fourth, I glanced down and saw my mother's name flashing on the screen. I knew exactly what she was going to say before I even listened to the voicemail she left, but out of curiosity, I played it anyway. Her voice was thick with emotion, half crying, half accusatory as she said, "Maxim, how could you do this to us? We are a family. You can't just walk away like this. You didn't even say goodbye. Call me back, please. We need to talk." I deleted the voicemail without a second thought. The texts from my dad were angrier. He didn't waste time on guilt trips. He went straight for the practical issue. His first message was short and blunt, asking, "Where are you?" When I didn't respond, the next message came through a few minutes later, longer and more desperate. "This is ridiculous, Maxim. You know we can't afford the house without your contribution. You need to come back so we can figure this out like adults." I scoffed at that. Like adults? Since when had anyone in that house besides me acted like one? The messages kept coming, piling up with every hour that passed. My mother switched from guilt to pleading, saying things like, "Please, sweetheart, let's just talk. I don't understand why you're shutting us out." My dad, on the other hand, stuck with frustration, saying, "This isn't just about you. We had an arrangement. You can't just abandon your responsibilities like this." Then, as expected, Artem finally decided to speak up. His message was exactly what I imagined it would be. "Dude, what the hell? You just left us? No warning? You really think that's okay? We're your family, and you just betrayed us like that?" I laughed out loud when I read that. Betrayed? This coming from the guy who had spent his entire life mooching off everyone around him without a second thought? He had no problem letting me pay for everything while he lived like a king. But now that he was finally facing consequences, I was the bad guy. I didn't even bother responding. Instead, I ignored every call, deleted every message, and went about my life like nothing had changed. It wasn't until a few days later that I started hearing from mutual friends about what was happening back at the house. Apparently, my parents had finally realized that without my money, they were in serious trouble. Bills were piling up, and with no extra income coming in, they had no choice but to turn to Artem. For the first time in his life, he was being told that he needed to contribute. According to my friend Daniel, who had heard the news from someone else, Artem had been completely blindsided. He had never expected my parents to actually hold him accountable for anything. He thought they would figure something out, that they would just let him keep living rent-free while they somehow made ends meet. But reality was hitting him hard, and now, for the first time ever, he was panicking. He had no job, no savings, and no idea what to do. Lisa, who had been just as comfortable freeloading, was suddenly realizing that her cushy setup was about to collapse. My parents, desperate to keep the house running, were demanding that Artem start paying his share. And Artem, having spent his entire life skating by without consequences, had no idea how to handle it. I imagined the scene back at the house, my mother wringing her hands, my father pacing and grumbling about money, and Artem sitting there, stunned, realizing that he couldn't just coast through life anymore. He had finally reached the point where his excuses weren't going to work, and there was no one left to bail him out. And I wasn't going to lift a finger to help him. For years, I had been the safety net, the one who made sure everything stayed afloat, while everyone else ignored reality. But now, I was out, and they were on their own. I had no doubt they would keep calling, keep texting, keep trying to guilt me into coming back, but it didn't matter. They had made it clear where I stood in the family, and now they were going to experience what life was like without me there to clean up their mess. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. Moving into my new place felt like stepping into a different life. The first night, I just sat on my bed, staring at the walls, letting the silence settle around me. No screaming kids, no barking dog, no passive-aggressive conversations waiting for me at the dinner table. Just peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells, waiting for the next demand or guilt trip to come my way. It felt almost unreal. Over the next few weeks, I settled in, getting used to a life where my space was actually my own. Living with Daniel was easy. He had his routine, I had mine, and we both respected each other's boundaries. There were no surprise guests taking over the apartment, no missing food from the fridge, and no expectations that I had to take care of someone else's problems. The best part was the quiet. I hadn't realized how much mental energy I had wasted dealing with the constant noise and chaos at my parents' house. Now that it was gone, I felt lighter, more focused. Without all the stress weighing me down, my productivity at work skyrocketed. I wasn't constantly distracted or frustrated, and I found myself actually enjoying my job again. My boss even noticed, mentioning that I seemed more engaged than before. And with all the time and mental clarity I had gained, I finally started working on my startup again. The project that had been sitting on the back burner for months was now something I could actually dedicate time to. It felt good to be making progress, not just surviving. Of course, my parents didn't let go so easily. The calls and messages didn't stop, though they did slow down once they realized I wasn't answering. My mother tried every tactic in the book: guilt, concern, nostalgia, but I didn't engage. My father, after realizing his angry messages weren't working, switched to a more neutral tone, asking if we could have a mature discussion. I ignored that too. I wasn't cutting them out completely, but I was setting boundaries. I made it clear that I wasn't going to be manipulated back into their mess. If they wanted to talk to me, it had to be on equal terms, not another attempt to get me to fix their problems. When my mom finally managed to get me on the phone, she sounded almost relieved, but the moment she started talking about how difficult things had been since I left, I cut her off. I told her that I wasn't going to come back, that I wasn't going to send them money, and that they needed to figure things out without me. She got quiet for a moment, then sighed and said, "I just don't understand why you are being so cold." I told her it wasn't about being cold. It was about doing what was best for me for once. I had spent years putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own, and I was done with that. She didn't have much to say after that, and I didn't offer any reassurances. When the call ended, I knew that was the closest thing to closure I was going to get. Artem, on the other hand, didn't even try to pretend he wanted to reconnect. A few weeks after I moved out, he texted me, not with an apology, not with an attempt to mend things, but with a simple, "Hey man, can you send me some cash?" I stared at the message for a long moment, then blocked his number without responding. That was it. No more obligations, no more guilt, no more being the one who held everything together while everyone else took advantage. I was done. Now, I wake up in a place that's truly mine. I go to work, I focus on my future, and I don't have to worry about anyone else dragging me down. It's not perfect, and I know my parents will probably always try to pull me back in when it's convenient for them, but that's not my problem anymore. I finally chose myself, and for the first time in my life, I don't regret it. Looking back, I don't know why I let it go on for so long. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was just easier to keep the peace than to stand up for myself. But now that I've walked away, I realize something I should have known all along. You should never let people use you, even if they are family. For years, I convinced myself that this was just how things were, that it was my responsibility to keep things running smoothly, to be the one who sacrificed so others could be comfortable. But the truth is, that wasn't responsibility. That was being taken advantage of. My parents knew exactly what they were doing. They had no problem putting all the pressure on me because they knew I would carry it. Artem had spent his entire life living off the generosity of others because no one had ever made him face reality. And for a long time, I let myself believe that was just the way things had to be. But now, for the first time, I am living for myself. I wake up without dread, without frustration, without that constant weight on my shoulders. My money is mine, my time is mine, and my energy goes toward things that actually matter to me. My work has never been better, my startup is moving forward, and I have space to breathe. There is no one banging on my door asking for favors, no one expecting me to fix their mistakes, no one using family as an excuse to drain me dry. I used to think walking away would make me feel guilty, but all I feel is relief. Life is easier, quieter, and more relaxed. I don't have to justify my decisions to anyone, and I don't have to put up with people who only see me as a resource. The best part is that I know, without a doubt, that I will never let myself get trapped in that situation again. The moment someone starts treating me like an obligation instead of a person, I will walk away without hesitation. So what do you think? Would you have done the same in my place? Or do you think I was too harsh? Have you ever had to cut off family because they refused to respect your boundaries? Let me know, because I would love to hear other perspectives on this.